You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. So today we're going to continue our discussion of the various diets. I'm going to discuss a couple of diets that were popular in the 70s and 80s and may be somewhat less popular now, but they're still out there. And actually, both of them still have a big presence. The first one's going to be what's called the Pritikin diet, Pritikin, Pritikin diet. It was actually started by a gentleman by the name of Nathan Pritikin. And he was actually an engineer. He was a businessman, went to college, dropped out, and then was a highly successful entrepreneur. Developed some patents for some big name companies and basically became a millionaire at a young age and retired around age 50. And then from that time on, he sort of dedicated himself toward healthy lifestyles and diet. And it was interesting. He went and had some form of study done. I can't determine exactly what was done, but it sounds as though he had an EKG done, right? Like a heart tracing. And they told him that he had some coronary artery disease, or the implication was that he had coronary artery disease. I'm guessing this didn't sit well with him because then it seemed like about that time he sort of went on this quest to find a heart-healthy diet and a healthier way to live. And of course, true to the government standards, the thought was that poor health and poor cardiovascular health in particular came from high fat in the diet. That line of reasoning all came from the Ansel Keys studies, which now we know was really poor science and really did a lot of damage and continues to do a lot of damage to the health of the American public. So Pritikin developed this healthy lifestyle and this diet and basically turned it into a business. Like I said, he was an entrepreneur and it was a place where you could check in and you could pay by the week. You would go in. It was almost like a resort spa and they would teach you how to eat, maybe teach you how to cook, teach you about like yoga and healthy lifestyles, stress reduction, and some exercise. Now, I don't know all the details about the original institution, but what I know is it was in Santa Monica. And when it closed in 1997, it had since become the Hotel Del Mar, which is sort of a famous hotel. His son subsequently has taken the company and moved it to Miami, Florida, and it still exists in that same form where it's a resort-like spa. You can sign up, register, check in. And they literally have like cooking classes, like culinary school. There's a lot of educational component. They teach you exercise and stress reduction. And then, of course, they work to improve your diet. It's extremely expensive. It looks like just from looking at their website, it looks like it's about $6,000 to $7,000 a week. And as I understand it, it looks like that's double occupancy of a room. So presumably be you and your significant other would go to the tune of $12,000 to $14,000. It's interesting. The diet seems to be the same. They do have an endocrinologist on board and they have a cardiologist on board. And when you look at their website, they claim that 83% of the patients that check in there have come off of their blood pressure medicines, that 54% have reversed diabetes, that 60% have reversed the metabolic syndrome, and that there's been a 23% reduction in the LDL cholesterol, which is your quote, bad cholesterol. When you look at some of the scientific literature, there's not a lot of literature that supports this diet. And in fact, the more we get into these diets and we learn about them, it looks like these carb-heavy diets really are not beneficial, at least from a weight loss perspective. Now, as I understand, Pritikin's original plan for this diet wasn't specifically weight loss, right? It was just overall health and particularly cardiovascular health. And there did seem to be some improvement in terms of lowering cholesterol. It's interesting of those stats that they have on their webpage. I don't know how legitimate they are or how accurate, but it's interesting that the LDL reduction is actually the smallest of all of the statistics that they cite. However, it kind of seemed to be one of the major goals. So what is the Pritikin diet? Well, it's an extremely low-fat, high-fiber diet. Now, remember, that's in contradistinction to, say, the carnivore diet. It's a very low-fat, high-fiber, very high-carbohydrate diet. And as I've said on this podcast a lot, obesity isn't caused by fat. Being fat isn't caused by fat. It's caused by carbohydrates. It's ultimately caused by an excess intake of calories. But carbohydrates are the real problem, and processed foods in particular. So Pritikin's diet, though, it was low-fat, high-carb. what his recommendations was that you'd have less than 10% of your caloric intake in a day would come from fat. 10 to 15% would come from protein, and the remaining 75 to 80% would come from carbohydrates, mostly complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates just meaning that they're associated with fiber, right? They're not just pure sugar, but maybe fruits and vegetables, dietary choices like that. So what is some of the problems with this? Well, it's limited. It's very restrictive. Not a lot of taste in a lot of those things, at least in my opinion. And with the fiber, there's a lot of flatulence, a lot of gas. Fiber is generally insoluble. It can't be broken up. And that's why it works so well in terms of if you're constipated, you take fiber, because as you eat the fiber, it doesn't get digested by the small bowel bacteria. And so it just sort of moves through the colon, and it causes a bit of an osmotic shift of fluid into the small bowel and then subsequently into the colon, which then helps with bowel movements, right? No different than magnesium, like milk of magnesia, or some of the bowel preps like you might take for a colonoscopy, right? It's just old semi-permeable membrane study from like 7th grade science, where you had a lot of solute in one little chamber and basically pure water in the other, and you had a semi-permeable membrane. And ultimately, the salt would diffuse so that they were equal in both chambers. And that's true in our gut too, right? So as fiber goes through the small bowel, fluid shifts from the cells of the small bowel into the lumen, into the channel, in an effort to try to equalize the solute between the cells and the lumen of the small bowel. So that's how fiber works. But as the small bowel bacteria are working to break down that fiber, it doesn't really break it down. That's why you get the osmotic shift. But what it does do is it produces a lot of gas. You get a lot of flatulence, farting, burping, and maybe some bloating with it. In addition to the less than 10% fat, 10 to 15% protein, and 75 to 80% carbohydrate, in the regression portion of the Pritikin diet, he recommends less than 25 milligrams of cholesterol, and then in the maintenance form, less than 100 milligrams of cholesterol. So that's pretty restrictive. What was his ultimate purpose? Well, like I said, he had been diagnosed with some sort of coronary insufficiency. Somehow, based on an EKG, he was told that his coronary arteries weren't keeping up with the function of his heart. It is interesting, in the data that I found, it said that he was asymptomatic. So I don't exactly know what to make of that, but it's important because that led him down this path of nutrition and this heart healthy diet. And so his general outlook was to improve cardiovascular health. There was some weight loss and then potentially control diabetes. And when you look at their current website from the Pritikin Institute that's run by his son, it sounds as though, according to their data, they're in fact meeting those goals. When you look at the scientific literature, though, there's really no scientific proof that there's any change in mortality, there's any significant improvement in cardiovascular disease. And so it's a little bit unclear from a scientific perspective how effective this is. One thing that is interesting, though, and I don't agree with this style of diet. I don't agree with a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, right? I think if anything, it needs to be the other way around. But it is interesting to know that for every gram of fat, it's worth 9 calories, right? You eat 1 gram of fat, that's 9 calories. You eat 1 gram of protein, that's 4 calories, or 1 gram of carbohydrate, that's 4 calories. So if you are shifting your caloric intake to carbohydrates, in that sense, you are decreasing calories. The problem is that carbohydrates, as we know, aren't very satiating, right? So you eat them and you don't feel full, or maybe you feel full, but then as that insulin rises to deal with all the sugar, it rapidly drops once those carbohydrates get into your small bowel. And that drop in sugar then causes your brain to tell you that you're hungry and you go back and eat more. So physiologically, second and third order, it's not really a very effective way to do it. But just on the surface, taking in fewer calories per gram of macronutrient is one of the things that they sort of push. They're not wrong on that fact, but in fact, the downstream effects of that really are not that beneficial. It is interesting when you start, there tends to be a lot of fluid shifts and a lot of urinary output. So there's a significant amount of weight loss on the front end. It's really due to water weight, which is okay, but it's not true weight. It's not really what you're looking to do long term. So what kind of foods are on the Pritikin diet? Well, again, high carbs. So fruits and vegetables, whole wheat pasta is a big one. Various vegetables like corn, peas, beans, lentils, yams, potatoes, oatmeal, brown rice, non-fat dairy. You can have a little bit of meat. They recommend less than 3.5 ounces of meat. usually in the form of like fish or a skinless chicken. Also, tofu's on the list. Foods that they really encourage you to avoid are like saturated fats, like animal fats, full fat dairy products, different oils like coconut oil or palm oil, red meat, of course, butter, sugar, and salt. The Pritikin diet kind of has it broke down into what they call go foods and stop foods and caution. So the go are the additional ones I listed, the fruits and vegetables, legumes, whole grains, and then the stop, of course, were the saturated fats, organ meats, processed foods, egg yolks, egg whites are okay, vegetable oils are out, palm oil, red meat, etc. And then there's some what they call caution foods, right? Like refined grains and refined sugars and salt in very limited quantities. It's interesting. This diet was ultimately authorized by Medicare as like a cardiac rehab diet, similar to another diet that we'll discuss called the Ornish diet. And the Ornish diet also received a certification, so to speak, or reimbursement from Medicare in terms of their heart healthy program. So Ornish diet was the first one to do it. And the Ornish diet and the Pritikin diet are remarkably similar. Are there any major cons? Well, other than like we talked about, like the flatulence and maybe just being very restrictive. One other thing is it can lead to a little bit of iron deficiency. If you have a lot of leafy green vegetables, you can get a fair amount of iron. But iron deficiency, magnesium, calcium were all sort of marginal. So it's recommended that you take some sort of a supplement of these, maybe a multivitamin as well. What are the general outcomes of the Pritikin diet? Well, when you look at the scientific literature, like I've said over and over again, it doesn't seem to be a lot that supports it, but it does look like on average, you have about a 7 to 12 pound weight loss associated with it. And according to their website, we talked about 83% of the patients that enroll come off of their blood pressure medicines, 54% reverse diabetes, 60% reverse the metabolic syndrome, and there's a 23% reduction in LDL cholesterol. So I think the coming off the blood pressure medicine, that's a very subjective measurement. That's easy. A 23% reduction in LDL, again, very subjective, very scientific. These others, including the 54% reversal of diabetes, be interesting to know what the parameters are that they're using. I mean, are they using actually blood sugars, hemoglobin A1Cs, over what period of time, and also a 60% reversal of metabolic syndrome? Is that every category of metabolic syndrome? Fatty liver, hypertension, obesity? Is it one of the three, two of the three? I don't know. Those two are much more objective and kind of harder to nail down. Like I said, the current Pritikin Institute is run by a son, and they don't take insurance, but they do work with you if you have a health savings account. Again, I'm not endorsing this. I actually think that this is the wrong type of diet. I think it's the right idea, right? A healthy lifestyle change where you're including stress reduction, increased exercise, and a better diet. That's fantastic. I just think the actual diet that they land on maybe isn't great. And I think for $6,000 to $7,000 a week, that seems a bit over the top, but they can get it. More power to them. I told you a little bit about Nathan Pritikin to begin with. Sounds like a remarkable individual. And really, after he had a successful career in business, turned his attention to a heart healthy lifestyle, really spurred on by this, quote, cardiac insufficiency that was supposedly diagnosed by an EKG. He went on, and in 1958, he was diagnosed with a form of leukemia. And it lay dormant relatively well till about 1980, but in 1980, it returned. In 1985, he was admitted to the hospital, and while he was in the hospital, reportedly he had pinned a note that just asked that they do an autopsy so that they could look at his arteries and see if this diet had been effective in managing his diet. And in fact, according to the reports, the autopsy shows that there was essentially no atherosclerosis, just some mild fatty streaking, which is great, except for we don't really know that anything was reversed because all we know is that he had an abnormal EKG decades before. So what that means is not entirely clear. Sort of a sad ending to a life that seems quite productive. With his leukemia or with his general health conditions, it sounds as though he was in pain. So while he was in the hospital, committed suicide, reportedly by slitting his own vasculatures, like in his arms, and bleeding to death. Didn't mean to bring you down on that one, but that's the Pritikin diet, sort of in a nutshell. Again, I'm not a huge fan. I don't think a high carbohydrate diet is the answer, but there it is. And the Pritikin diet and the Pritikin Institute continues on. If that's something that you think you're interested in, or you think that would work for you, I would encourage you to look that up. So let me talk a little bit about the Ornish diet. This diet was created by Dr. Dean Ornish, And Dr. Ornish came up with a diet remarkably similar to the Pritikin diet only years later. But again, it's a low-fat, essentially high-carbohydrate, plant-based diet. He recommends less than 10% of your calories come from fat. He recommends less than 10 milligrams of cholesterol daily, so significantly less. There's no sugar allowed on the Ornish diet and only a very small amount of alcohol. It's interesting, the no caffeine is a part of it, although if you drink green teas, that's allowed. I don't know what the science behind that was, but that was a caveat to the Ornish diet. So what's on the Ornish diet? Well, it's very similar. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, poultry, fish, egg whites, no egg yolks. So what's out on this? No animal products, right? The Pritikin diet, you could have a little bit of animal product. On the Ornish diet, no animal products, no processed foods, no unhealthy fats. The Ornish diet continues to have a program, and it's a holistic program very similar to that of the Pritikin diet, where they have exercise, stress management, a social component, and the diet all sort of wrapped into one. It's a total lifestyle diet, so to speak. So again, I don't think these low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets are the answer, but I do think the approach of an overall lifestyle change in terms of exercise and stress management and making it a lifelong change as opposed to just a simple diet till you hit a certain weight and then go back to your bad habits. Like I said earlier, Dean Ornish's program for reversing heart disease actually was a non-surgical program to get insurance reimbursement for weight loss. He did have some high-profile clients. He was a physician to Bill Clinton. I think maybe Hillary Clinton at least had a relationship with him. I don't know if it was a doctor-patient relationship. I think President Obama may have had a patient-physician relationship, but I don't know that for a fact. But of course, these high connections definitely help you when you're trying to get your program on to the Medicare reimbursement program. So the Ornish diet is remarkably similar. It's a little more strict. There's no meat, no nuts, no avocados, essentially no fat. It's more restrictive. I really don't think either one of these diets are a good long-term diet. They both can work in terms of weight loss. But again, like we've talked before, calorie restriction is your best bet. And I feel that calorie restriction, particularly if you can minimize carbs and processed foods, that's going to be your better choice, right? Because when you eat proteins and fats, they're more satiating. So you eat them, you feel full quicker, and you stop eating. Yes, it's true. Fats do have more calories per gram, as we discussed earlier. But in the end, I think that a high fat or a high protein diet is a better choice. That's all I have today on the Pritikin diet and the Ornish diet. I hope you found this useful. Next week, we're going to discuss one more combination of diets. We're going to discuss the Atkins diet, which is very much a keto diet, and we'll just discuss it briefly. And there's another one called the Duquesne diet that I'm going to discuss, and it's a high-protein diet. Then I think we've exhausted everything we need to do on the diets. If there's a particular diet that you'd like for me to talk about, please feel free to send it in on socials or on our website, thebmipodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you, and I will do my best to answer. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then. The BMI Podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Be sure to check out our description below for our website and social media platforms.